It's been 20 years since the Asian foreign exchange crisis hit Korea. Through hard work and dedication, Koreans overcame the crisis and built the 11th largest economy in the world, but not without costs. Labor market indicators have plummeted both in terms of quantity and quality, while irregular or contract employment has soared. Jobless figures are also up, fueled by the ever-rising youth unemployment rate. What can explain the poor work environment and the high youth unemployment? That's the topic we're exploring on this week's Upfront.
Last month, an 18-year-old high school student died in an industrial accident during his vocational training at a beverage factory on Jeju Island. Investigations revealed that he had been working alone and unsupervised 12 hours a day. Last year, a 19-year-old maintenance worker who was on the on-site training program was killed on duty after being caught between the screen door and the train at a subway station. On-the-job training for high school students is considered one of the key measures to tackle youth unemployment, as it offers hands-on experience as well as potential employment opportunities. However, following a series of fatal industrial accidents involving young workers, there are growing calls for improved workplace supervision and safety. Despite various efforts by the government to boost the country's job market, youth unemployment still remains a serious challenge. In October, Korea's official unemployment rates for young people aged between 15 to 29 hit a record high since 1999. The country's real unemployment rate also hit an all-time high since 2015. Some call into question the effectiveness of the government's job programs for youth, including allowances for young job seekers. About $2.7 billion was set aside to fund them in next year's job budget totaling $17.6 billion. This is the largest budget ever for employment programs targeting the younger generation. On this week's Upfront, we identify challenges facing the nation's job market and explore the effective solutions to address workplace safety and youth unemployment.
We are joined by two experts in the studio for today's discussion. Please welcome Lee Ji-soo, an attorney at law and former economic advisor to the Democratic Party of Korea.
Hello, good to see you again.
And Lee Jae-young, a member of the Liberty Korea Party Supreme Council who specializes in youth policies. Welcome.
Thank you.
Let's begin with the recent news of the death of a high school student from a vocational school in Jeju Island. He died while working at a factory as part of his on-site vocational training. And this is not the first time an accident like this happened. First of all, what do you think causes these industrial accidents involving high schoolers on vocational training?
Before I make any comment, I do want to sincerely express my sincere condolences to those victims and his families. Without doubt, it's a tragic incident. And there are many factors that cause such death. Vocational schools often send their students to the site where they become a real workers. But still, the legal status of those people are students. They're not supposed to be sent to any risky areas or do any, hazardous work.
That regular workers
like the very
do,
trained
right?
regular workers would do. But if you see the incident, he was taking care of a very dangerous machine, and there was no supervisor along with him. That's again the violation of the many regulations. There are many regulations that are in place, but none of them work properly. With regards to this incident. And it should never happen again.
Well, expanding support for vocational high schools and expanding the vocational on-site vocational training itself were part of the key policies under the previous two administrations. But some say that they focus too much on the results, the numbers. For example, the employment rate, that it led to unwanted side effects. What would you say to that?
First of all, I also myself express my condolence to the victim himself as well as his families as well. I think we need to look at it as a separate thing. You cannot mix everything together and say vocational training is a bad thing. Because if you talk to many people, not only inside Korea, outside Korea, So for example, if you talk to people from ILO, they always say that the schools and private sectors are very unhappy about how schools are not getting their students ready for real work.
Yeah.
And vocational training, the idea of vocational training is to fill that gap so that we are preparing students or youth to be more effective once they go into this workforce. It is to help them. It is not to deny their right or exploit them. Now, what happened in Jeju Island is obviously a tragic incident. And as he said, there were many violations and regulations already in place. And we need to look at those. We need to look into details and how we need to improve the system itself. But I don't think we can demonize the whole system because of this incident. We have to make sure that, in the future, students don't have to work without the supervisor, that companies need to make sure that these students are well taken care of in terms of work hours, in terms of safety and whatnot. But we cannot demonize the fact that preparing our youth well so that they can be effective, so that they can have good jobs, so that they can have good life, family. I mean, this is the main idea of vocational training.
In the case of the student that died, he was supposedly working 12 hours a day, but the issue of long working hours is not limited to these trainee students. It is, in fact, a national problem. President Moon Jae-in recently mentioned it. And statistics show that Korea's working conditions are among the worst in the OECD, and our average annual working hours exceed the OECD average by more than 300 hours. There are discussions at the National Assembly about cutting down on these long working hours, but there's opposition as well. Where do you stand on this issue?
I think previously Mr. Lee has pointed a very important point. When policymakers or lawmakers or even the government people make some certain policies, well, I don't think they have any evil intention. Problem is there's a huge gap between any policies and what's really happening in the field. Like the tragic incident. I mean, I totally agree, and I support the idea of training the students and sending them to the work field well prepared. But the problem is there is no administration, which means the gap existed. That's why it ended up in a very tragic accident. With regards to the working hour, yes, we must start from somewhere. So changing some regulations and doing a lot of things at the policy level. It's almost inevitable now. But the problem is we can't stop there.
Again, there's going to be a gap.
There's going to be a gap. And I work at a private sector myself. So regardless of what the national policy is, the corporations in general want their workers to work as many hours as possible. I understand because they want to cut down the cost and maximize the revenue and the profits. That's the main rationale how the corporations may survive. So simply driving or implementing such policies should not be the end of the problem. They always have to monitor whether it is being truly implemented down to the bottom. What I mean by that is, yes, we must start from the regulatory changes and must legally protect overworking people. But at the same time, we must also change the mindset of the corporations. We also must change the culture because I was born in 1960s. Back then, hard working was something that you should be proud of. People often, we as a Korean, often, moved around the world and said, we are very hardworking people. Yes, it was an engine that, allowed us to become where we are today. But now, many things changed. We can't just be proud of overworking.
And hard work doesn't necessarily translate to long working hours because in terms of labor productivity, Korea is quite low as well. So
in the past, we had no other national assets but the workforce. So that was the only resources that we can rely to stimulate our economy. Many things changed. We now have a lot of capital embedded. we can utilize our brains. That's more important than just asking the people to work hard.
Do you think the work culture can change?
I think it needs to change. We need to encourage, Mr. Lee said, we have to encourage, if not force, corporations and general society to change its cultures for working less hours. But like you said, it doesn't mean being less productive. For example, before I joined National Assembly in 2012, I was working in Switzerland, in Geneva. I was working for the World Economic Forum. And, we had lunch break for 2 hours. It was mandatory. And we get there by 9 o'clock. I got there a little bit early, about 8. And then we got out there at 6 p.m., no matter what.
With a 2-hour lunch break in between?
With the 2-hour lunch break. But if I look at myself back then, I don't think I was ineffective nor not productive at all. But it had to do with the whole culture, the corporate culture, where when you're sitting down on your desk, when you're working, you need to work. You cannot do anything else but work and make sure that you deliver what you promised to deliver. In Korea, I believe all workers and all employees do try to be effective, but for some reasons, it hasn't really trickled down, or it doesn't really affect the all corporations, which I feel that it has to do with culture rather than regulatory issue. So I think making this a mandatory for corporations to work less and make that as some sort of form of law, I think it's a good start. I think it sends a good message out there. But it really needs a follow-up actions. When I say force corporation, it doesn't mean that we need to make sure and we need to penalize them. What I'm saying is we need to bring a positive change. We need to convince corporations that they need to train their employees for a better future, what working less means, that it doesn't mean being lazy. So I think we need to go through the series of trainings and series of discussions in order for this culture to settle down.
You think it's up to the corporations to change their mindset?
I think corporations has a lot to do with it, yes. Government obviously do have responsibility. So starting for government employees to work less is a show of example. So it sends out clear message out there, which is a good idea. But when we have these kind of discussions, when government pushes these type of policy, people always look at it with different eyes and they have different perspectives. So when private sectors do it on their own, people look at it as, wow, these guys really want to change as a pure reason. But when policymakers do it, they have room to politicize it, which is something that we don't want.
Well, even the president himself, he has firm belief that allowing some leisure time to the workers would end up being more creative. There are certain limitations that the government can do at a private sector. They can't force them, they cannot, twist their arms to do, or, the way they manage the companies. So like Mr. Lee pointed out, all the government can do is to show some role model. This is an example. This is how I want private sector also to follow. But then it's totally up to them whether to follow it or not. When I was working for a private sector, we also had very similar regulatory system like we have today. I was supposedly allowed to have 4 weeks of vacation. 1 day per month for leave.
Yes, how many did you use?
Exactly, that's the point. We know such rules existed, but I cannot dare ask my supervisor or boss because I'm legally entitled. That's the thing that I want to see some change.
Yes, Koreans work too much and can't spend their vacation days freely. But for young job seekers, even that is a luxury they can't afford. Korea's youth unemployment rate is about 3 times higher than the OECD average. To provide financial support for these active job seekers, some local governments have introduced youth allowance programs, but these programs are also drawing mixed reactions from the public. Take a look at this next video clip.
The Youth Allowance program is designed to offer financial support to young people looking for jobs. It provides monthly allowances of up to $460 for 6 months to young job seekers aged between 19 to 29 who have met the eligibility requirements for household income and job hunting activities. The program, which is now available in 9 cities across the country, including Seoul and Busan, has received a mixed response. What does the public think? The majority of young people we interviewed on the streets who could potentially be the recipients of the allowance said they were in favor of the program.
개인적인 생각으로는 구직을 포기하는 청년들에게 좋은 정책이 될 수 있다고 생각합니다.
지금 취업생들이 이제 많이 힘든 상황인데 그 취업 이제 정책으로 청년수당을 준다면 아마 취업준비생들에게 동아줄 같은 그런 기회가 되지 않을까 싶습니다.
저는 긍정적으로 생각을 하고요. 요즘에는 이제 아르바이트를 하는 청년들이 많은데 그 아르바이트 비용만으로는 좀 부족한 부분이 있거든요. 그래서 국가가 적극적으로 나와서 지원을 해준다면은 아마 긍정적인 효과가 있을 거라고 생각을 합니다.
But there is also skepticism that cash payments are a populist measure with long-term effect that could reduce recipients' incentives to find work. We discussed the effectiveness of the Youth Allowance program, which is being expanded to more cities.
Well, it's not unsurprising that young people who would benefit from the program are in support of the program, but there are voices of opposition as well. Where do you stand on the issue of youth allowance program?
Well, the reason why young people welcome such policies is not just I don't think it's just because they are young and they are the targets of those policies. Considering the dire situation that they are situated today, it's devastating. You know, I lectured in the university for over 10 years. And the mindset or those uncomfortable feelings of those students, it have gone beyond what I've expected. You know, they're very anxious about their future. The statistics shows that about 30% of the college graduates will not end up in any kind of job. I mean, all these empirical data and the reality must have given them a lot of pressure. They do want to ask for certain support, financial or non-financial, from whether it is the municipal government or the central government. I don't think nobody can blame that. So yes, it is the reality. You know, the dire situation that they are situated, we must understand them, and we should not make this as a political debate.
So in terms of the payment method or amount, do you think it is actually providing practical support?
I personally support, you know, whatever form of allowances that are provided by either the central government or the municipal government. But when you go down into the municipal level, there are so different forms of policies. I do like giving out some allowances without any selection process. That's my personal preference. The reason why I'm saying that is because people might say, well, it's unfair because some privileged class, youth can also receive those benefits. Isn't that unfair? But then you have to think about the administration cost. In order to select them, sometimes it costs more.
So you're in favor of universal
type of allowances given out to all people that fall on that category.
One of the biggest questions people have, though, is whether the money is being spent for its intended purposes. In other words, looking for jobs.
First of all, I personally support the idea of youth allowance. But I think we need to make sure that it is designed well. So the purpose of this allowance or any forms of support that we give to youth is to make sure that it'll end up raising their competitiveness, not to diminish their competitiveness. Because by definition, it is to give them a sort of oomph so that they can start their life in a positive way. But if this becomes a poison, so that these kids or these youth becomes, not compatible or competitive in the real world, then it will lose. It has definitely gone in the wrong way. And also, second part of this youth allowances is that at the end of the day, this is taxpayers' money. Yeah. We have to be, as a government, as a policymaker, make sure that we can explain well to our taxpayers that we're spending this money in a good way, that it'll do society well. I mean, good. So if we can explain that, if we cannot come up with the good reasons why these allowances will help these kids and will end up being raising their competitiveness, then there is a fault in design. So, and when I look at some of these, allowances programs, and as Mr. Lee said, there's a bit of difference in, from municipality to municipality. And I have to wonder, and I have to ask that question, whether this has been designed well. And my answer is we can improve much, much more.
I have no intention to argue that the system that we have is perfect. Yes, there's always room for improvement, and I agree. As he pointed out, we can save more taxpayers' money and increase the effect. But the ones that we have today, if you look at the amount, the absolute amount that are paid to those young people or the class, I don't think it has reached to the point where it will have any negative impact on their competitiveness or the will to search for the companies. It is a meaningful money, but it's not
big enough to dissuade them from actually looking for work.
Yes, I don't think it has reached that amount. No government in this country has that much, budget to dissuade those young people. If we can focus on the way how it can be improved, as a policymaker, we're always open, we're always ready for the debate. But if it is a problem of whether to wipe it out completely, totally objecting to it, I can't support that idea.
Yeah. Well, in the meantime, the National Assembly finally passed next year's government budget, a considerable portion of which will go towards creating public sector jobs and bankrolling next year's minimum wage hike. Do you think these policy efforts will prove effective in tackling youth unemployment?
Not really. I think we are making mistakes by thinking that increasing public sector jobs will solve all problems, especially in the youth employment section. At the end of the day, the 10,000 or more, whatever the budget that they passed of these newly created jobs that'll have, it'll bear taxpayers' money again. But it's not just one time, payment. It will accumulate. And it'll accumulate into such amount that it'll be unbearable. Now, who's going to pay for it? Youth, the future generation. Future generation of kids that we see today. And we're talking about kids who are not even born. We're putting all these debt, all these burden to future generation. So I think, yes, it might seem to have some sort of improvement in youth unemployment, which I'm not sure whether it will, but if it does, it's going to be very short term. And when you look at the long term, it'll come back to our youth or our next generation as a big burden.
Well, I think everybody knows that job creations should be led by the private sector, not the government. But at dire times, the government measure of creating public sector jobs seems to be a quick solution.
You're right. I think in a dire situation, government sometimes need to do what it needs to do in order to bring that hope, to show the message. Maybe that the increase in the public sector jobs will send message to private sectors that guys, you need to do your job as well. But still, I'm not sure whether what we passed yesterday will send that message.
My point is there is no such thing as a silver bullet that can kill all the birds. But the problem is we have to start from somewhere. Whether it's a government initiative or it's a private sector, somebody must start doing something. We can't just point our finger saying, well, you do it first, I'll do it next. So the government is now taking the leadership and trying to expand the government sector by recruiting more people. The sector or the part of the job that are focused to create are mostly those are related to securities, people's daily life, like firefighters, police forces. Many that we already know there are certain problems. And again, I point out, it has to be more jobs must be created by the private sector without doubt. And there will be different policies that would encourage the private sectors to increase more decent jobs.
Work culture reform and youth employment are essential to realizing President Moon Jae-in's vision for a people-centered Korea. Let's keep a close eye on whether his policy initiatives can really gain momentum next year. Thank you two very much for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you.
That's all for this week. Upfront will be back next week. Thanks for watching.